Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to spend some time talking about how we can go about evaluating and documenting internal controls. We're going to spend some time also looking in terms of cost benefit considerations and also what happens when you have too many risks or too many controls. To help us better understand these dynamics associated with part of the planning process, we have with us Kathleen Crawford, who is going to help us better understand these dynamics. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So, we have some questions for you. So, I'm glad you're here because I'm confident you can answer them for us. So, in terms of how we go about evaluating and documenting internal controls, so what are some of the things that internal auditors need to keep in mind as they go about through this process of making sure they get this done?
Well, I have a graphic for that. Let's talk about verifying first that the system of internal controls is adequate, is effective, and efficient. This is a baseline. We want to be certain that there are controls that offset the risks and that there are enough of them and that whatever they are, that they be both effective and efficient. We can have controls that are effective, but if they're very cumbersome, if they're very costly, this might not be the best mix for the organization or if, for a particular process or functional area. So we also want to lean into efficiency, that it be cost effective, that it be simple and easy to accomplish. Otherwise, we might find that they are completely avoiding the system of internal controls in order to get things done. The
Okay.
bottom line here is that we want to help management achieve its objectives for that area of the business, but not in a way that is going to hamstring them or make it so difficult that the control won't be followed or won't be enacted.
Okay, so big part of what we're trying to find out is whether the kinds of things that management thinks are in place are really in place. And as auditors, as we have gone through the exercise of doing the risk assessment, if what we thought we understood is actually what is happening. So it's a matter of verification or confirmation to some extent of these facts as well. Now, I like what you said about cost benefit because it sounds to me like there could be a cost associated with controls because some people may think, well, controls are free, but that's not necessarily the case, or not at
Seldom,
all the case.
seldom the case.
Right. Okay. Very good. So, what else do we need to keep in mind?
Well, a few other things are important for us to consider. You're right, we have to verify that those controls are actually present. We have the expectation that they are, but we want to make sure that we understand what a control point is and how it operates. So, a control point is any event in a process where an error may occur. Now, we expect there to be a control in place to mitigate that very jargony word that we use a lot in internal auditing. But essentially, what that means is that a control should exist in that place, in that optimal place, to prevent or reduce risk to an acceptable level. Some people think
Okay.
of this as an extra set of eyes, that we have an opportunity to check, to double check. And when I use we, I mean the collective we. The organization has the opportunity to check to make sure that things are okay before the process proceeds. And if not, that it might stop the process from proceeding, or we have to think about maybe the cost benefit analysis, and maybe it's more beneficial in the long run that we just detect that something has possibly been amiss. So that extra set of eyes reviewing the process.
So when management really, where they basically set their objectives, they have their programs and process in place. So there are some expectations about the way things are supposed to work. The
Mm-hmm.
question is, are things working the way they were designed? And that's where those extra pair of eyes comes in, is just to verify that what was intended is actually achieved. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. It is. It's about intention, it's about the plan, and does that action or that activity proceed as expected, as planned, as intended?
Okay, great. Very good. Okay. And what are some of the things? Is there such thing as an internal controls questionnaire and so on that any mechanism to capture some of that information and document it appropriately?
Absolutely. We could use internal control questionnaires. We could draw flow charts. So, this opportunity for us to document what is and make sure that how it lines up with what was expected. We want to consider those different types of errors that could occur. We want to make sure that the necessary controls are in place. So we might converse with management. We might ask questions, as you say. An internal control questionnaire is a wonderful mechanism for that. I would recommend, though, to our viewers that you don't just presume that a questionnaire is going to be sufficient to the task because it's phrased in closed-ended questions, and the pattern of expected answers is not very difficult to predict. So we want to make sure that the control questionnaire is supplemented with other things, even conversationally. You can have a conversation and confirm or refute some of the details on the ICQ. Also, drawing flowcharts or taking flowcharts that already exist and updating them to the present tense is another terrific way to document controls and to evaluate whether or not they're in the places that you expect.
Excellent.
Walkthroughs. On an earlier episode, Hernan, you and I talked about walkthroughs not really being about walking at all, but that's another way that we
True.
can document whether or not the controls are where we expect them to be and operating in the way that we expect them to be. We can grab screenshots of important transitions in a system or a process, and that can form the basis for our documentation of whether or not things are operating as expected.
Okay. No, that's very helpful to keep in mind. Sometimes may assume certain things, and that's something we want to avoid. We want to verify, corroborate, and make sure that we get the facts straight. So, in terms of the cost of the control, there are some cost benefit considerations that we need to keep in mind. So, what are some of those that will help an auditor get his mind or her mind in the right frame as they proceed capturing this information and making sure that they're not creating a situation where the costs exceed the benefit?
Indeed, indeed. Another graphic or another way to frame this is in asking questions. So we want to make sure that the control benefit outweighs the expense, as you said. So we really do need to look in more detail at what, again, reviewing what the risk is and what are the possible outcomes or consequences of this particular risk area. What is the cost? What is the benefit for the control itself? An important benefit to a robust system of internal controls is to make sure that the business operates as management intends. And viewers might remember from a previous episode that we spoke about that as being a really important principle that we're trying to follow, is that we're not making recommendations for something other or more prohibitive than what management intends, because management and the leadership structure sets the risk appetite, and we want to just make sure that the balance of risks and controls is in keeping with that risk appetite that they have adopted. So
A couple of ideas.
go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of things that come to mind as relates to the cost benefit, and I'm thinking about different dynamics that I've experienced over the years as an auditor. One of the easier ones that comes to mind is petty cash.
Mm-hmm.
And years ago, many organizations had little boxes with petty cash around for incidental expenses, but the amount of effort and the administrative burden of keeping this little cash box around was such that it just didn't make any sense. So a lot of organizations got rid of it. It just found another way, or basically forbidding any kind of these incidental things and just have them either go through expense reimbursement or just having a purchase card or something like that, or having a central individual who will handle those expenses. So different arrangements, but having this little petty cash thing was just not worth it. Another thing that comes to mind as another example is insurance. And so many audits over the years where we were looking at warehouses and facilities, and you look at insurance policies, and as time goes by, sometimes the carrying inventory value goes down, and the policy is insuring more merchandise than what you actually keep on an average basis because you have become more lean, just in time mechanisms have worked better over time, or the other way around. We are very familiar with the risk of being underprotected. So you're underinsured. For example, that same building, the value goes up. You want to make sure the coverage on the building is commensurate. But on the flip side, which is where sometimes the thought process doesn't necessarily covers that, but as we're talking about having a mismatch between cost and benefits, where you may have, like I said, the valuation of the merchandise often gone down because you're keeping less in stock, then you're over-insuring. And insurance is one example of a control mechanism to mitigate the risk of loss. So those are some ways that comes to mind.
Yeah.
So as we're thinking about the cost benefit dynamics, what happens when you have too much? I guess I just kind of started thinking because I was just thinking about it myself, but I would like your input as well on what happens when you have too many risks or too many controls. Is there such a thing?
Oh, sure, sure. That balance, the equilibrium that the organization wants to strike, is sometimes a little bit delicate. So conditions involving excessive risk with not sufficient control, with insufficient control, could lead to loss of assets, loss of grants, poor business decisions. So if we are in a riskier situation than management is aware of, they might pursue a direction that's not going to be beneficial to the organization and could put them into some difficulty. Non-compliance situations. So I can think of the agency that I use, the human services agency that I used to work for, and that that all of their decisions were driven by contracts with a couple of different states in the northeastern part of the United States. And so those contract requirements were absolutely sacrosanct. If some of the staffing ratios were not maintained, we would have been in violation of those contracts, setting up a situation of noncompliance, which could have led to some significant fines or perhaps even a loss of that business. That's how serious some noncompliance situations can be.
You also have
Go ahead.
You also have the risk of fines and penalties.
Mm-hmm.
You can also have regulators and so on who may impose sanctions on the organization for failure to comply. So definitely something to keep in mind. When you're thinking about regulators, what else can they do? I will imagine that they can also increase regulations if your organization and potentially others are not doing what they're supposed to, and we have losses that impact local communities or investors or personal injury. You could potentially have increased regulations as well, right? Is that one of the possible outcomes?
In fact, yes. we can actually point to Sarbanes-Oxley in Sarbanes-Oxley Act of yes. 2002 as a very widespread and wide-ranging type of regulation that went into place because of some poor decision making and some poor actions by several different publicly traded companies. So you're absolutely yes. right. It can lead to some significant issues or increase in regulations. Most
yes,
definitely.
Yeah. One other thing that comes to mind is a few instances, and actually I know someone who had this happen as well at the time before the regulations were in place, but it had to do with organizations that were trying to manage their cash flow, and they will deduct they make the tax deductions from employees for various reasons, medical costs, dental costs, 401k contributions, and other things like that. And instead of remitting those monies over to the organizations that were supposed to invest their funds or keep their policies in place, the organization was using that that float. And it got to the point where people were complaining that if I had bought those securities when they were supposed to be bought, I would have gotten a better price. And of course, the regulators intervene and put some standards that say you cannot do that. You take the money from the employee, you need to make sure you expeditiously remit that to the organization that's going to invest it, so you don't harm the employee along the way. So definitely, that's a very important consideration there with regulations. So how about when you have too many controls? It may sound odd for auditors to say that there's such a thing, but it can happen, right?
Yes, bureaucracy perhaps is one of the largest effects of excessive controls. Another one could be reduction in productivity. So having to go through very many steps for a relatively small benefit often is a consequence of too many controls. In fact, speaking of that, this is another reason why the COSO Internal Control Integrated Framework update in 2013 came about, because in the intervening years between Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002 and the updated COSO framework in 2013, there had been a significant increase in complexity and a reduction in productivity, because some organizations had just layered a lot of extra controls. You know, the thinking was, well, if one control is good, then three's got to be better. That's going to protect us. But that's not the case. So,
Right.
so that definitely sparked a greater interest earlier in this 21st century to look at excessive control just as scrupulously as we look at excessive risk. So
Exactly.
these
Very, very important.
no value activities, you know, somebody might just be sitting on a bench, just checking things that don't have any consequence, along the
I have
lines of what you had said before.
I have a stamp and I want to use it. So let me stamp every piece of paper. And by the
Yes,
way, I don't have enough paper. I still have ink left. So could you give me more paper so I can use up my ink? Uh, that's not the way to go. We don't
right,
want that at all.
right, right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Kathleen, thank you so very much. It was so helpful to have you here with us so we can talk about these things and help explain and clarify what goes into this process. So, as we're looking in terms of how we evaluate and document internal controls, in terms of the cost benefit considerations, and looking at what happens when you have a lack of equilibrium between the two. We need to have them in balance. And that's how organizations can be more effective, more efficient, and get their work done without unnecessary extra costs associated with their programs and processes. So thank you very much.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.